Good afternoon. I'm Phil Weiler. I'm Vice President for Marketing and Communications here at Washington State University. I want to welcome faculty, staff, students, and other members of the WSU community statewide who are joining us today for the 2021 State of the University event. Last year's event was one of the first WSU activities that we had to cancel due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I can say that I'm certainly pleased that we're going to be able to resume this WSU tradition today. Much has changed in our lives during the last 13 months that we've dealt with the pandemic. One of the things that we have learned how to do is how to use technology to increase the ability to bring ourselves together. And so obviously we're using that again today to be able to bring more of us together for this State of the University event. As an example, in the 2019 State of the University event, we were in Bryan Hall, which is a historic building here on the Pullman campus. We had maybe 300 people in attendance in person and another 300 or so available who are joining us online. We expect our online attendance today to far surpass those numbers from 2019, and it is really due to the fact that we have this technology available to us. So the State of the University Address has been an almost annual university event since at least the mid-1980s, when Sam Smith, who served as WSU's 8th president, really kicked that tradition off for us. The address provides us with an opportunity for our statewide community to celebrate the achievements of the past year, learn about our current priorities here at WSU, and consider opportunities for the future. Traditionally, the State of the University event, as I mentioned, has been delivered at Bryan Hall on the Pullman campus. Again, it's a very historic building here in Pullman. But today's event is coming from a different location. We're actually at the Lewis Alumni Center here in Pullman. This building has an interesting history. It actually is a restored former farm barn that has now become the welcoming spot for WSU alumni, family, and friends. So we're pleased to be able to bring you the event from the Lewis Alumni Center. This afternoon, President Schultz is going to be highlighting a few of the significant university achievements, and then we're going to have an informal conversation between President Schultz and Provost and Executive Vice President Elizabeth Chilton. We're going to talk about the evolution of the WSU system. The dialogue is going to be addressing topics that were suggested to us by a number of university groups, including the Faculty Senate, the Graduate and Professional Student Association, Associated Students of Washington State University, and the Student Government Council, which represent WSU students system-wide. In addition, we'll also be addressing questions from the members of the audience, those of you who had the opportunity to share your questions, your thoughts, and comments with us. If you are one of those folks who took the time to do that, thank you. We appreciate it. It's now my pleasure to introduce WSU President Kirk Schultz and Provost and Executive Vice President Elizabeth Chilton. President Schultz is nearing the end of his 5th year as the university's president. He became the 11th president of Washington State University and a tenured professor in the Jean and Linda Voiland School of Chemical Engineering and Bioengineering on June 13th of 2016. That came after a 7-year tenure as president at Kansas State University. President Schultz has made remarkable progress as WSU's chief executive. Some of the milestones achieved during Kirk's tenure include record student enrollment, record research and development expenditures, the addition of new academic degree programs to meet state standards, and the continued growth of the College of Medicine, which I'm happy to say is going to be graduating its first class of students this May. Provost and Executive Vice President Elizabeth Chilton began her WSU duties last July after serving 3 previous years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Binghamton University in New York. Prior to her tenure at Binghamton, Provost Chilton spent nearly 16 years as a professor and leader at the University of Massachusetts. She served as a professor, anthropology department chair, and associate vice chancellor for research and engagement among other roles. Among Provost Chilton's top priorities at WSU include creating meaningful and productive system-wide partnerships and addressing issues of systemness, building and maintaining our strong commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and promoting modeling of a whole life philosophy for faculty and staff. With that, let me turn it over to President Schultz and let him make his opening remarks.
First, thank you, Phil. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today online. This will seem a little different than some of the previous State of the University addresses, but I look forward to doing just a few slides to kind of hit some high points. And then what we're going to do is do much more of a Q&A, fireside chat with the community. We feel it's more appropriate kind of during this time than me doing a 45-minute long formalized slide presentation. I do want to take this opportunity to thank the WSU community, our faculty, our staff, and students for your resiliency during this time. Many of you are dealing with a lot of issues besides just going to school or working at WSU. You've become K through 12 educators. You've had to deal with elder care. You've had to deal with work-life balance in and out of the home. And sometimes lots of people crowding around, all using the internet at the same time, all being on Zoom meetings. So I'm very proud of our community and the great job that you've done, and thank you for going that extra mile. And with that, I would like to go ahead and start off with the first slide, please. So welcome to the 2021 State of the University Address. What I'd like to start with is some top accomplishments for the year. And since we're doing this in a very abbreviated format, I'm just going to hit a very few things that I think are really related to COVID-19 accomplishments by our faculty and staff. So next slide, please. I want to give a shout out to our colleagues in the AOI space and express my appreciation to Dave Soleil and his entire team for all the training work that people did as we pivoted about a year ago to go from in-person instruction, came back after spring break, and went to online instruction where we've been the last year. I also appreciate our folks in ITS and Extension and the work that they did on our drive-in Wi-Fi hotspots project. So many people we assume would have access to high bandwidth internet connectivity, and we found out that for some of our students, faculty, and staff that was not the case, and they needed the ability to get access to high bandwidth connectivity for taking classes, for teaching classes, and participating in Zoom and other types of video meetings. So thank you to everybody who had a lot to do with that. We've also had over 150 WSU research projects during this time on COVID-19 related issues. I also want to give a shout out to our nursing faculty and students and our pharmacy students for helps with both vaccines as well as testing. And also a big thanks to our Northwest Public Radio colleagues for the work they did passing on COVID-19 related information both on the air and on their website. Next slide, please. We also, many of you are undergoing a lot of COVID-19 related research and scholarly activity. I mentioned the 150. I'm just going to mention 4 kind of key projects that I think are really pertinent to some of the outstanding work that many of you are doing. WSU was one of 11 universities selected to establish centers for research for emerging infectious diseases with our colleagues at WSU Global Health Kenya. This was a $7.6 million grant through the National Institute of Health, and we congratulate all the colleagues around the world associated with this endeavor. Deidre Buchwald, a professor in the L.S. Floyd College of Medicine, received a $4.4 million National Institute of Health grant to study the impact of COVID-19 on the American Indian and Native Alaskan populations. Ofor Amram, also from the L.S. Floyd College of Medicine, is leading an important study to assess the impact of COVID-19 lockdown and cancer screening. Finally, WSU researchers led by Courtney Meehan were part of a multi-institutional project, and there have been a lot of those out there with our colleagues at the University of Idaho and others to study whether breastfeeding women who have COVID-19 transfer milk-borne antibodies to their babies. Congratulations to these researchers and these scholars and the great work they're doing, as well as all the other folks that we didn't have time to mention today. Next slide, please. Well, we've all seen that during this COVID-19 time and during this pandemic, issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion have continued to arise around our nation. This is something that we've continued to work on diligently as a leadership team, as faculty and staff and students during this particular time. This is such an important topic. Elizabeth and I will address this in more detail during the fireside part, but there's really two things I want to point out. The first is the 5 working groups that were formed in 2017, and many of you watching this today may have been involved and engaged with those particular working groups, really completed their work, put together a report, and what we want to do now is evolve to stand up our first President's Commission on Campus Culture and Climate, and we'll be talking about that during the remainder of the semester and hope to have that stood up by May. We also established a President's Task Force on Equity and Policy and Practice led by Zoe High Eagle Strong and Mel Netzhammer. We've got lots of ways we do things here over the last 30 or 40 years, and we've never gone back and looked at a lot of the policies and things that we do through an equity lens. And I appreciate our colleagues, faculty, staff, and students that are going through this. And then finally, we completed our revision of Executive Policy 15, which prohibits discrimination, sexual harassment, and sexual misconduct. And it was the first really comprehensive overhaul of this policy for many years. Next slide, please. Part of our land grant mission is strong support of state agriculture. This last year saw the launch of the new Cosmic Crisp apple. I don't know about you, but I probably have a Cosmic Crisp probably 3 or 4 times a week. They're a little bit a part of our kitchen. And we now have more than 17 million Cosmic Crisp trees that are planted all over the world. And really want to give a shout out to our breeders and our folks in ag that really worked hard over many years to come up with this really successful apple and apple launch. We also have a new plant sciences building that was opened this fall on the Pullman campus. And we appreciate the great leadership and support of our legislature by providing facilities that our faculty, staff, and students need to do that cutting-edge research that I talked about earlier. And then finally, we opened up a new honeybee and pollinator research, extension, and education facility in Othello. And this came about through donor dollars that were supporting this effort. And we had a facility that came on the market kind of unexpectedly, and we were able to purchase it and stand up this facility probably 5 to 7 years earlier than we thought we might be able to under other circumstances. So we'll continue to strongly support agriculture in the state. Next slide, please. Well, we'll talk more about some of the system-related things coming up, but one of our first system things that I've been a part of as president was really the launch of Workday. In 2016, we had a group that met that said we really needed to update our financial and human resources system, and we started a 4.5-year project at that point to put Workday up. Now, for some of you, Workday may be a bit of a swear word. It does mean that we do things a little bit differently. And I appreciate the fact that the learning curve is steep, but I also think we're already seeing some payoff and things that would have taken weeks to do before. Some of those things now are done literally in a half hour that would take a long time. So I just want to shout out to Stacy Pearson and Matt and the whole team involved and engaged with Workday implementation, and want to ask and continue to ask for patience as things that people are used to doing, they knew how to do well. Now all of a sudden they can't do the way they used to, but we're going to be better off. I'm a big fan of the 70s, at least from music, but not a big fan of 1970s technology, so I'm really glad that we were able to upgrade to Workday. Next slide, please. Well, that's just one way that we've started to strengthen the WSU system. Next slide, please. So this last year, as a matter of fact, in June of 2020, the Regents approved our first ever WSU System Strategic Plan that laid forth some operating principles by the way in which we wanted the system to operate. Some of those operating principles you've heard before, but I'll just repeat them again. 1 WSU, 1 degree, 1 faculty, shared accountability, operational excellence, fiscal stewardship, data-informed decision-making, and community partnerships. These are not new things to WSU, but they're first time to put them down kind of in writing in one place and say, this is how we want the WSU system to operate. Now, how do we operationalize some of these kind of key principles? Next slide, please. One of the first ways that we worked on doing this was through the Roles and Responsibilities report. And we appreciate Carson College Dean Chip Hunter and his colleagues that worked over about 9 months to put together a really comprehensive report on some things that we needed to do to continue to modify the system moving forward. I can't really repeat, nor should I, all the things in the report here, but some key things that came out of that were we needed to resolve some of the major inconsistencies in our current structure. Is Pullman a campus, or is it the center of our system? We need to establish a system-level budget process. We need to establish a system-level process for enrollment management. We need to balance marketing and communications between system messaging and communication and individual campus messaging and communication. And taking all those things now required some action steps. And so next slide, please. That led to us putting out really 2 different concept papers or white papers. The first really talked about that it's time for us to really put forward having a chancellor for the WSU Pullman campus. This is a logical step in our progression to make sure that we have a flagship identity for the Pullman campus while supporting the rest of the system. The second concept paper or white paper really talked about ways that we can achieve operational excellence across the system. Now, both these came out. We got a lot of feedback. Some people liked some of the things in there. Some people felt that we'd missed the mark on a couple things, and we were able to use that feedback to come back and make some modifications, and we want to continue to do that moving forward. Next slide, please. Well, we do have some challenges that are coming up. Next slide. Really, the first is around operationalizing one WSU. And I just want to express my appreciation to our faculty, staff, and students for your willingness to think about change, to be engaged in change, to be positive about us being able to do things differently. Now, clearly, this brings with it some significant apprehension. People want to know, well, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my job? What does this mean for my ability to do things? Is this just going to be administrative bloat, or is there going to be something down the road that's going to mean that I can do what I like to do and want to do with students better than I could before? We'll talk about that more in just a minute. The budget. We've been getting really positive news out of Olympia over the course of this legislative session, but the legislative session isn't done yet. So far, the state of Washington's economy has made a really amazing recovery in most sectors, and we really think that we're going to get some good news as we get through the legislative session. But until the budget's finished and signed by the governor, we don't want to do any early celebrations, but we're feeling really good. We also have gotten a lot of stimulus funds coming our direction to help with students and families from the federal government. The bottom line is we're not going to really know where our budget stands until May. We get done with the legislative session, we know what the stimulus money is, we know what the impacts of COVID have been on enrollment and other things, and we'll present out to the WSU community at large our proposal for where the budget will be this next year, including discussing things about what we want to do with tuition, what we might want to try and do with salary increases and other types of things as we get that budget done. Finally, I just want to say with enrollment, we're lagging a little behind where we would like to be on enrollment. But if we learn one thing in the pandemic, some of the indicators that we'd used for the last 30 years are no longer as accurate as they once were. And we're just going to keep tracking that. And I know Saichi Oba and all of our colleagues in enrollment management across the entire WSU system are out there working hard to make sure we bring in a fantastic set of new Cougs for the fall of 2021. So with that, I look forward to answering some other questions, to engaging with Elizabeth, and I thank everybody for joining us today for this year's Town Hall, or State of the University.
Kirk, thanks for looking back at some of those top accomplishments for the last year. I think we can all agree there's plenty of reason for us to be optimistic about the future of WSU. I think we're on the right trajectory. What I'd like to do for the next 45 minutes or so is to dig a little bit deeper into some of those topics that various members of the community asked us to address. I'd like to look at the future evolution of WSU's statewide system and how we can better address the needs of students, faculty, staff, and the citizens of the state of Washington. The kinds of things that we talked about wanting to discuss include exploring the One WSU system concept, discussing the university's efforts to end systemic racism, and to talk about lessons that we've learned through COVID-19 and things that we can take away from this last year to make our educational enterprise even better. But before we jump into that, speaking of the pandemic, we have seen lots of good news in recent weeks and months around the availability of vaccine. We've got 3 vaccines that are approved, a 4th that is perhaps on its way. People are starting to look to the future. I guess I would want to kick things off to both Elizabeth and Kirk and ask the two of you, what are those things that you're looking forward to doing once we're the pandemic is behind us?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we're looking forward to doing in 2022 now is back going on cruises. Noel and I like to attend a cruise a year, and we enjoy that sort of opportunity to vacation. But more importantly, it is completely disconnected. You know, you can't connect. And given the pressures of our jobs and things like that, it is nice sometimes to have a week where you're just disconnected from all the electronic media that we get so used to. So that's the number one thing I'm looking forward to during this next year.
Well, I think I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to mention 2 things. One on a professional note is, I've been in my position for 8 months now, and I met more faculty this morning at the showcase drive-through to present awards than I have in the past 8 months. And so I'm really looking, it's the first time I've been in this building, so I'm really looking forward to meeting my colleagues across the system and getting out to all of the campuses and the nooks and crannies of Pullman to meet our faculty, staff, and students. On a personal note, though, some of you have heard this already, but I'm a choral singer, a choral singing addict, I would say. Actually, I try to limit myself to no more than 2 or 3 choruses at one time. And, singing with others elbow to elbow and making amazing music is sort of like my yoga. And that's the one thing, of course, we haven't been able to do, which is sing with our masks off, elbow to elbow. And so I'm really looking forward to being able to do that soon.
Well, if you can do a professional one, I guess I can too. So I would say I'm looking forward to football Saturdays in Pullman again. And I've had the opportunity to live in 4 small college towns, and a football Saturday, it's not just the football game and athletics, it's people come back, they see their professors, they walk through buildings. We have lots of meetings around that. There's some energy in a place like Pullman on a football Saturday, and you can't help but go around and sort of feel as everybody kind of comes into town. You see the RVs in the parking lot, and just you bump into people that you maybe haven't seen in a year or two, and I'm really looking forward to that this fall.
Great, thank you both. I like that Elizabeth has shamed you into having a professional goal for the post-pandemic period. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. We've talked a lot about this idea of One WSU. I sort of see One WSU as the roadmap that we'll use to both evolve and strengthen our WSU system of campuses. And so I think it is an important conversation. It's been certainly something that has been on the forefront for this last year. I know both of you have had an opportunity to talk to a lot of different groups about One WSU, but this is probably one of the largest audiences that will be able to hear from you directly about what One WSU is, what it means to you, and more importantly, what it should mean to students, faculty, and staff, and why it's important. And so I'm going to address the first question to the two of you, if I could. For each of you, what are the one or two most important things that you want people in the WSU community to know about One WSU?
Well, I'll go ahead and get started. There are really 2 points I'd like to make. The first is just a reminder that this is a multi-year process. I think sometimes people are thinking that we're going to try and do this whole thing in a couple months, and that's not really our intent. I think it's really important that we spend the time to have the conversations that we need to. We stay on a deliberate pacing, but even after we appoint and that Pullman chancellor starts in their position, it's going to take a couple years after that just to sort things out and how they work and to make sure that we're doing this in a really, really reasonable way. So it's kind of like Workday. If you don't start at some point, you're never actually going to get to implementation. I think I want to remind people it is multi-year. The second thing is to remind folks to continue to send in things that you like about what we're proposing and things that you think need some work. And I think out of the first 2 concept papers, we got some pretty pointed and appropriate feedback, and we're able to make some modifications based on that. So nothing is set in stone. We want the campus community, and I mean this in a larger sense, campuses community, to be involved and engaged in helping WSU get better moving forward. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I guess one thing that I would say is that some people have referred to, what is this new system? What is this new one WSU system? And I guess what I would say is, we are one WSU. We are one accredited institution with 1 degree, 1 central location for tenuring of faculty. And we have a number of system officers who serve various activities and have responsibilities across the system. So we already are one WSU, and yet, as Kirk said, we already have our physical campuses, our global campus, and our many extension locations around the state. So really it's about how do we balance serving those local constituencies, our communities, our students, and our faculty and staff, while at the same time making good on the strength of being part of one system. So we really seek to try to augment and maintain the things that are working well, and then try to improve both transparency and clarity in roles and responsibilities for those things that are not working particularly well.
So we've talked a little bit about the what. I'd like to actually address the why now, if we could. I'll ask this of both of you. First of all, why is one WSU important, and why now? Why are we looking at this in 2021 versus some other point in time in our history?
Yeah, sure. I think for the why, again, I've been at WSU for 8 months, and this was something that was raised throughout my search process, throughout my onboarding process. People talking about systemness, a word I had never used, I don't think, before last April or so. And so it's clear that it's been on people's minds between the Drive to 25, the Systems Strategic Plan, the Roles and Responsibilities Report. People have been talking about these things. This isn't a new concept. But it's important in the system evolution to be purposeful about how we make those changes. I think any institution I've ever been at, change often happens sort of organically, incrementally, and you never stand back and say, does this make sense? Can we make improvements that are a little bit more systemic? So I think the why is just to be more purposeful about what the kinds of change we need to implement and to utilize all the work that's been done over the past year or two and really try to make some positive change. The why now, I really feel like the pandemic has shown us all, we've actually learned some things about ourselves individually and as a system. What are things that are working well, and what are, we'll get to this a little bit later in our chat, what are some of the lessons we can take away, but especially given the sort of shocks to the system, if you will, I think there's really no better time than to try to implement change from what we've learned.
I think I'm going to start with the why now. Several people have said things like, wow, it seems like those concept papers just came out of the blue. Why all of a sudden in 2021 are we seeing some things? I will go back several years and say, as I visited other campuses, as I sat down with our deans across multiple campuses, a lot of times I heard frustrations, and not necessarily with any individual, but it wasn't clear who sometimes had decision-making authority. It wasn't clear if we want to do something new or different, how to actually do it. And what happens is effective leaders just kind of find ad hoc ways to do things, but that's not really a great optimal way to run a large complex system. So I would say over the last couple years, it started with the development of the system strategic plan. Then in this fall, we had a couple letters to campus letters to the WSU community that I sent out that started to talk about a set of interconnected campuses and why we needed to grow in that particular direction. So I look back and say this has really been a 2 or 3 year process that has gotten us to this particular point. And I think during the pandemic, one of the things that we've learned is Zoom makes everybody the same, right? When we do these leadership meetings across the system, everybody's the same size box. Doesn't make any difference where anybody is. And I think that's also kind of accelerated a little bit, that now is a good time when people aren't having to travel back and forth a lot to sit down and start taking some concrete steps. Now, as soon as you start taking concrete steps and get out of the philosophical realm, some people are going to disagree with that. And I think that's part of an academic community, is putting ideas out, debating those particular ideas, modifying them, but then at the end of the day, continuing to sort of move forward. So I think it is the right time. I think coming out of the pandemic, it's going to be important for campuses to set themselves up and systems and universities for growth, but growth across the whole spectrum of student needs, from our students that are place-bound, that can't come to one of our physical campuses, for the high-achieving students that graduate in the state of Washington that want a really superior academic experience like they might get in the honors program in Pullman or other places, about students that may have, first generation, never thought about college before. To me, I want us to be able to really meet all those needs. And I think by using the same structure in the same way we have for the last 30 years is not going to accomplish that in the way that we could. It's not that we won't be successful, but I think we can be more successful if we really do a nice job with this system optimization, design, evolution, call it what you will. But it's us taking what we currently have, I hope and believe, and making it better.
You know, Elizabeth, I like that comment you made about being purposeful in our evolution. I see large organizations frequently will evolve organically, and things make sense in the moment, and then they become institutionalized, and you look back at them and realize that it doesn't make sense anymore. So I think it makes a lot of sense periodically to be able to stop, take stock, and say, if we're going to do this, how are we going to do it in the most effective way? So thank you for sharing that. I'd like to follow up with you, if I could, Elizabeth, on a question that has to do with the implementation. We heard President Schultz say that he sees this as a sort of still a multi-year process. We're maybe a couple years into the process. We've got a couple more years to go. I guess from your perspective as provost, how would you see the implementation process playing out over that next couple year time period?
Well, I think at this point, we've gotten a lot of feedback from the System Council. We met with them on Monday. Was that just yesterday? Yesterday. And we would like to continue to get feedback from everyone. I think in the PowerPoint there was a URL for people to see the concept papers, see some of the background, provide feedback, and the frequently asked questions will continue to grow as people send in more questions. But I think really thinking about what are the activities and the functions that are best served by the system, by system officers and offices, and then what are the things that we might look to delegate more authority to the individual campuses and locations. And that's the stage that we're at now. That's what we spent a lot of time with the System Council talking about. Once we have that sort of high-level structural changes in mind, and we have a certain amount of consensus on that, then really we can start over the next few years thinking about what that means for trickle down. So, Kirk likes to use the example of widget science. If we decide that, we want to delegate more authority for widget science on campus X, well, what does that mean for that campus? What are the things that are working well already in widget science? What are the things that, that we're going to need to provide more support for or more delegated authority? So I think it's really starting at the high level. What are the functions, really? That's where we're focusing on our thoughts and conversations. What are the functions? What are the activities? What are the responsibilities and accountabilities that we want to see across the system? And then that will allow us to really dig down and get into the specifics from there over time.
I would also point out that when Elizabeth talks about consensus, there will never be 100% complete consensus on anything. We're a university community. I don't think we ever get complete agreement on anything. What we want to do, though, is make sure that we're being deliberative in our pacing, that we're communicating frequently on that pacing, timelines, things like that, and give plenty of time for debate, but also recognize that at some point you have to say, okay, we're going to move on and take that next particular step. So it's a balance, right? Those out there that are watching this that have been in leadership positions, there is no manual that says here's exactly how to do it. And we're just going to continue to talk with our colleagues, work with our governance groups, students, faculty, and staff governance groups, the Board of Regents, the faculty at large, our student groups across the multiple campus communities. Anyway, we're going to work with all those, and we're going to continue to keep them involved and engaged and part of the process. And I think that's the best that we can do. And I'm optimistic that at the end of it, not everybody will agree, but I think we'll be deliberative enough that nobody can say, I didn't have a chance to give my opinion, I didn't have a chance to participate, or my voice wasn't heard. And I think those are really important attributes as we move through this process.
Great, thank you. You know, one of the things I know that's been discussed as we've talked about this idea of one WSU is the fact that there's a number of senior leaders who metaphorically wear two hats. And by that, I mean they have a responsibility for the entire system, but in many cases, if they're based in Pullman, they might also have those same responsibilities in Pullman specifically. And I think, President Schultz, you're probably the best example of that. You are the president of the system, all 6 campuses, but you are also the de facto chancellor of the Pullman campus, the largest campus in our system. You're responsible for the day-to-day operations of that campus. So you essentially have those 2 jobs that sometimes, I imagine, are pulling you in different directions. I know you've talked about the need for us to look at splitting up those duties. So my question for you is, how do we go about breaking apart those system roles from those Pullman roles, but doing it in a way that doesn't create another layer of administrative bloat, for lack of a better term?
Well, Phil, I appreciate the easy question, and I can probably condense my answer to 10 minutes, so everybody can go get a cup of coffee if you want to, if you're watching. No, I'll keep it much shorter than that. Right now, I think one of the challenges that a lot of folks have, and it really came up in a roles and responsibilities report, is it's never clear when many folks in senior leadership positions make a decision. Are they making it from a systems point of view? Are they making it for the Pullman campus point of view or another campus location? And I think this has come up frequently again and again and again, as it's just unclear. And I think Elizabeth did a great job when she arrived at starting to say, this is as the system provost. This is as Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs for the Pullman campus. And I think after those first few conversations that she had with many of the people watching, it was just a real reminder of the 2-hat role. I like to use the analogy of like a Swiss Army knife, right? Many of us are we do all these different jobs, right? You have these different tools in a Swiss Army knife. But when you got to do a real project or something really large, what do? You go to your toolbox and you're going to grab the proper tool to do that. I think what we need is a set of individuals that are going to think about the system as a whole, how to be optimal in the way we work with system function, and each campus deserves a leader that is going to be at student functions, at faculty functions, at staff functions, and I think that's really, really challenging to do the way that we're currently set up. We recently had an opportunity to listen to Tony Frank, who is the system leader at Colorado State, and they recently went through a very similar transition there. And what that does is they now had somebody, Tony had served as campus of the leader of the flagship campus in Fort Collins, and sort of had moved to this role. And the idea really was, as a system there, they call it a chancellor. The system chancellor was really to work on strategic planning, legislative and government relations, and fundraising. And I think those are the types of things that, as a system president, I want to be able to focus and spend my time on. And I want to make sure that whomever serves as that Pullman chancellor is here locally in the community, focused around really helping to build this campus and the campus culture and move it to the next step. The administrative bloat thing is a real issue, and it's one that I want us to be particularly careful of. And we've mentioned in multiple communications, our plan is not to bring in a lot of people from the outside, but to promote individuals from within the current WSU community to serve either in the system role or the campus roles. And my goal is, at the end of this, that it gives people that are currently here, that everybody's working with, an opportunity to step into a new leadership opportunity and position, but not go out and add lots of layers of bureaucracy or more executives that people would argue we just don't need at this current time. So we're going to be mindful of that. We're going to put out organization charts that are conceptual in nature, and we know people are going to count. You know, how many new people is this? What's the cost? And we want to keep that low while building out the system that WSU wants to be, not necessarily a duplication of anywhere else.
So Elizabeth, I'm going to direct this next question to you, and I think it's really particularly important as we talk about One WSU, and that's this idea of how do we go about funding this system. We talked earlier about the fact that our system has been around for 30 years and it has evolved organically, and one of the things that has evolved in many different directions is our budgeting model, and for each campus it's different. For colleges it's different, and so you have been tasked, I think, with trying to bring some order to that chaos. And one of the ways I know that you're doing that is that you've launched the Executive Budget Committee. You're co-chairing that with Stacy Pearson, our Vice President for Finance and Administration. And so if you could, I'd love to have you just spend a couple minutes talking about what is the role of the Executive Budget Committee, how will it work, and of particular interest to me is I'm curious to hear about how the WSU Executive Budget Committee compares to your experience at different universities. Is this a model that other universities have used, and has it worked well?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question, Phil. It's something that I actually get really excited about. When I was interviewing, Stacy Pearson was one of the co-chairs of the search committee for my position, and we got started on this road, and I think people couldn't shut us up after a little while. You know, really, when you have a strategic plan and you have goals for your university, you need to make sure that you have ways to have your resources follow those goals and support those goals. Otherwise, a strategic plan is really fiction unless you know how you're going to have the resources and be able to focus the resources to make those things happen. And so really the charge of the Executive Budget Council, which includes, I think, about 15 faculty, staff, and students, deans, chancellors, and many other people across the entire system, the goal is to really look at our current budget model and processes and make recommendations for improvement. So it's not a group that's going to necessarily live on in perpetuity and be in charge of distributing the money, but really making concrete recommendations about how to change how we have funds flowing and how we assess costs. And I'll give you an example. I mentioned before that our system, like many university systems, has grown incrementally, sort of organically, where you patch on this, you add a campus, you add a new program, and it isn't as if anyone stood back and said, let's design this from the start. And the same with our budget. We have an incremental budget, which most universities have. And what that means is that the best predictor of your budget next year is what your budget is this year, whether you're a department head, a vice president, or a chancellor. And instead, we want to make sure that we have a way to have resources flow both with changes in costs of a unit and also changes in revenues as they're coming in. And this will provide leaders a way to plan, to say, well, if I were to create this new program, what would be the revenues and what would be the costs? How do I make sure I know I'm going to have the resources to do what I think I'd really like to do to serve students, to serve our faculty, to serve our communities? And so it's really about making recommendations on how to change our processes and the underlying budget model. And Kirk's going to use a big cane and like pull me off the screen in a minute if I go on too much longer on this, because I can really get going. But your second part of the question was how it compares. And what I will say is that I was involved at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst on a 3-year process to do something very similar to this, and really engage the entire university committee in understanding our current state. How do things work currently? And what I've learned is that many members of the WSU community don't understand how our current budget model and process works, but then also make recommendations for improvement. And those can be really long-lasting, and many universities don't take stock like that and really plan mindfully for how they're going to get their resources to match up with their priorities.
Well, Elizabeth, on behalf of my colleagues, I will say to you and Stacy and the other members of the committee, Godspeed. I know that is a big task, but clearly something that the university needs to tackle. So thank you for taking that on. President Schultz, Kirk, I'd like to have you talk a little bit about intercollegiate athletics, if you will. You mentioned earlier that one of the things you're looking forward to is those college football weekends. But I'd like to hear from you what does Pac-12 athletics mean to WSU? Why is it important? It's a topic that people have been discussing in recent weeks, and I'd love to hear your perspective on the importance of intercollegiate athletics, if you think it is important to the academic enterprise and to the institution as a whole.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I know this has certainly been a topic of discussion with our colleagues in the Faculty Senate and faculty and staff and students sort of across the WSU system. So let me just give a couple things that I think are important. First, I think it gives an institutional point of pride. And we have lots of institutional points of pride. For some people, it's not intercollegiate athletics, but for a lot of our alumni and folks like that, it's something that they remember about their time in school, as well as it's a net attractor to bring people back into town and our community, and really assists us with fundraising and development and things like that. The second thing, it's really, really important to our community. I think we saw, unfortunately, in COVID-19, when we didn't have football games, basketball games, things like that, you didn't have that net influx of people spending money in our community, going to restaurants, going and shopping in the retail establishments in the Pullman area. And I think it really hurt our area by not seeing that influx of people coming into Pullman multiple times during the year. I also think it provides some branding for the university on a national scale. And we've attempted to quantify some of this, but I really do believe if you look, it really shows our symbol, the name of the university, things like that. Almost everybody out there certainly been somewhere in the world where somebody's recognized that, and it'd be very difficult for us to simply buy that branding out there. Athletics isn't for everyone. I happen to be a fan. Some people don't think it should be part of the university, but I think it's an integral part of what we do on a Pullman campus, and I think it's important for us to not just do it well, but I also think that we should expect intercollegiate athletics to also live within their means and live within a balanced budget, and that's going to be important for us to continue to work on with Pat Chun and Stacy Pearson and their colleagues. Before I leave athletics, just a shout out to our women's basketball team who played in the NCAA tournament for the first time since 1991. And just congratulations to the coaching staff and those outstanding student athletes, and look forward to making their mark in the history book. And it was great to see Washington State on national TV participating in the women's tournament.
Great, thank you for that. As I mentioned earlier, we did reach out to a number of stakeholder groups, asking them specifically for questions that they would want us to address. And what I'd like to do for the next couple minutes is really try and address those directly. And the first question I'm going to ask is from the Faculty Senate, and I'll address it to both the president and the provost. And that really the question is, how many decisions around this idea of one WSU have already been made, and is there anything left to really decide?
Yeah, we're looking at each other trying to decide who wants to answer that. I think there's been a general feeling that we have this playbook, it's all written, and that what we do is rip out 2 pages and put them out, and then we wait a couple weeks and do that again. No, it's not. There's not a lot of decisions that have been made in concrete. I think the one thing is that we do need to continue to make some changes in the way we operate, in the way we work as a system. And so if somebody says, well, is it all completely flexible? I would say no. But on the other hand, there's no secret book that's got, here's exactly what it's going to be, and we would dribble it out. There's a lot of people who said, look, if you got a complete plan, just give us the whole thing so we can take a look at it. And instead, we decided to do it more this way, where we put out some concept papers, solicit feedback. When we feel people are ready for that next step, we continue to work on that. And so we think the next thing that we'll put out to the campus community is some draft charts that kind of show system level functions versus campus level functions and what that would look like, with some core principles and some data from other systems that kind of illustrate how other people do it, not so we duplicate one of them, but so that we have some sense of what other people are doing out there. So people ought to expect to see some of that in the next couple weeks.
Great. Elizabeth, I'm going to ask this next question of you from the Faculty Senate, and has to do with promotion and tenure and what that process is going to look like moving forward. So what developments have already taken place this year across the colleges to create discipline-specific tenure and promotion guidelines? And is there the possibility that individual campuses may create additional tenure and promotion criteria?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Phil. I really have to give credit to Laura Greiner-Hill. She's the Senior Vice Provost who's been working with me since I started my position. And she and I started talking about this early on, when I arrived, and said, tell me how things work here. Let's start with tenure and promotion. We started looking at the guidelines, and I started to hear how things had been working historically. And really from my previous experience, as Dean of Arts and Science College, which had everything from material science to music, I knew that general university-wide T&P guidelines often don't get at discipline-specific products of scholarship or creative activities, and that faculty often felt that it was a bit of a black box, and it didn't allow faculty to have substantial mentoring because there were misunderstandings of expectations. And so I've really encouraged, and Laura has worked with all of the personnel committees. She's been joined by Lisa Guerrero, who's the Associate Vice Provost for Inclusive Excellence, on really creating clarity in tenure and promotion expectations for departments and even for subfields within departments. I can tell you as an anthropologist that a biological anthropologist will have very different products of scholarship than a cultural anthropologist or a linguistic anthropologist. And so providing those discipline-specific guidelines allows us to have conversations with faculty, really, dialectical dialogues with new faculty about what the expectations are. So they're less of a bar to reach, but more of a conversation starter and a tool for mentoring of our pre-tenure faculty. I have suggested, and we've suggested in some of our concept papers, that we might think about the same thing for campus locations. Here on the Pullman campus is the research flagship. That is not to say that there aren't research expectations in Vancouver and Everett, in Tri-Cities, and certainly in Spokane, the research expectations are probably going to be quite distinct from many of the departments on the Pullman campus with the heavy strength in health sciences. So it's really about providing those mentoring tools and allowing those campus locations, the chancellors, the vice chancellors for academic affairs, the program directors on those campuses, to really determine how can we have clear and transparent guidelines that can serve as mentoring instruments, still meeting the standard of excellence that we expect for a tenured faculty member in WSU. I would say though, it's not as if, again, like Kirk said, it's not as if we have this all worked out, we're gonna tear that page out of the playbook. This is more of a suggestion, a question, putting it out there, really asking the campus community and all the campus communities to really weigh in on this. In what ways would this be helpful, and what ways could this present issues? And I would like to work with my colleagues across the system on this in the coming months.
So we have time for one more question in this section, and what I'd like to do is go to a question that came from our Graduate and Professional Student Association. That group noted that in the 2 white papers regarding 1WSU that were released earlier in the year, there really wasn't much in there about graduate students and professional students. And so their question, quite logically, I think, is how will the 1WSU system specifically impact graduate and professional students, particularly given the fact that many of our graduate students are at research and extension centers. The administrators who administrate for those, for the system tend to be in Pullman. They're not necessarily at those research and extension centers. So how do we ensure that decisions are being made in the best interest of the research centers and the students who are doing their academic work there? And Elizabeth, maybe I'll ask you that question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll start. I mean, certainly in terms of graduate students, postdocs, and our undergraduate students for that matter, the goal of improving our system is to best serve our students first and foremost, whether they are undergraduate students, extension students, researchers. Our students are the primary focus of our excellence and our strength, and our faculty and staff are really there to serve them, to guide them, to mentor them. And so, we're going to continue to say that loudly, that the goal of this is to make sure that we're not undermining things that are working well to support our students, but at the same time identifying ways that we could do better. As we move forward, for example, we have gotten a lot of feedback about our graduate programs. And I actually, to be honest, I learned some things. I think Kirk learned some things too from the feedback that we've gotten about graduate programs that are shared across the system, that we didn't even know the depths of those connections. And in fact, I won't name any names, but there was one chancellor who said that he or she learned quite a bit from some of the feedback we got about graduate programs. And so we want to preserve what's working well. And again, I would really encourage all of our students to give us feedback on what are the things that are not working well, what are things that are working well that you think we could do more of, so that we can strengthen the system overall. I don't know, Kirk, if you want to say anything more about that.
I've had the opportunity to visit all of our research and extension centers over the last couple years, and anybody who's been to those centers knows that there are substantial numbers of doctoral students, master's students there, and occasionally they felt at some of those locations that we worried a lot about the culture and things in Pullman, didn't worry so much about people in other locations around the state. This is the type of thing that we think some of the system redesign will really help us to make sure that we're looking out for those graduate students and those learning opportunities they have across the WSU system. So we want to enhance it. We don't want to take away any opportunities, but we want to make sure no matter where a student is in the WSU footprint across the state of Washington, that we're just doing a really great job supporting them in their scholarly work.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up this section. I will remind folks, as the president mentioned earlier, there will be additional information coming out in the next couple weeks around 1WSU. I would encourage you to keep an eye out for that. As you heard, we are very interested in receiving feedback. If you haven't had a chance to look at the first 2 white papers that were referenced, I'll let you know that there is a 1WSU website available. It's president.wsu.edu/system-development. Please do visit that site, take a look at what's been posted so far, and if you've got thoughts and concerns and feelings, this is a great opportunity for you to share those. So now what I'd like to do is turn our attention to systemic racism. This is a topic that has been in the forefront of our national conversation for the last several years. Certainly it's been a topic of concern and something we've been grappling with at Washington State University for a number of years. I think there are signs that we're making progress, but I also think we can all agree that there's still much work that we at WSU can do to address these issues of systemic racism. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes on this topic if we could. President Schultz, could you maybe describe the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that remain a priority moving forward and how important it's going to be specifically for white people to deepen their understanding of what anti-racism means?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And this is important to the entire WSU community, no matter where you are. And I would encourage everybody to look out in the literature, look online, read some books. We have some outstanding resources available. And I would encourage everybody, regardless of background, just to become more informed about racism. I also want to just remind our colleagues that the way to be informed is not to find a colleague of color and go and say, what should I be doing differently? There's so much research out there that you don't need to do that, nor do you need to take one of your colleagues and put them in an awkward position sometimes of trying to have those kind of conversations. And the third thing that I think is really important to remember is we need a civic environment, and we have to understand that some of our colleagues are going to disagree on some aspects of racism or their viewpoints on racism. And we don't have to agree with that, but we do want to make sure that we allow civil discourse and differing opinions to be out there. And I think sometimes we worry about that these sensitive topics, it's very hard to have a disagreement. And I think if we can't do that in a university community, we can't do it anywhere. But I encourage everybody, be informed, go out there, do some reading, challenge yourself, think about what things you can do personally differently. And I think if everybody does that, that's not a solution, but it's a step in the right direction.
So Elizabeth, I know there's been a lot of work done in the Provost's office around the questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you mentioned earlier that Lisa Guerrero has a new role as Associate Vice Provost for Inclusive Excellence. Can you tell us a little bit more about what her role will entail and what kind of work we can see coming out of that new position?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Phil. So yes, the Associate Vice Provost role for Inclusive Excellence existed prior to my joining the WSU community, and the position was vacant when I arrived, and so I worked with Vice Provost Laura Greiner-Hill, and I asked colleagues really across the President's cabinet, across the system, really I asked the deans, what are the greatest needs? What do we need from this position? And we really recrafted it for at least what I knew of the current state at the time. And it's a particular time in our nation's history and the world's history. And I knew we needed to provide some really strong leadership. We did a search this fall and brought in Professor Lisa Guerrero, who has been doing a number of things, even though she's only 0.5, she's only a half FTE in my office. Her other half is her faculty position. But she's been leading a faculty cluster hire in racism and social inequality in the Americas, and if there's time, I could say a little more about that. She's also been working with faculty search committees. She's been working with personnel committees, hiring committees, and we've also brought in Tremaine Gaither, who's a special assistant to the provost for Inclusive Excellence. He comes to us on borrowed time from the Honors College. He's been teaching a lot of anti-racism and mindfulness to our deans, to our department heads. The two of them have been working together to form best practices in mentoring, in inclusiveness, and I really want to thank both of them for their leadership in what I hope will be transformative for the institution.
Could you spend just a second or two talking a little bit more about those cluster hires? You mentioned it's racism and social inequality in the Americas. What's the goal behind that cluster hire, and where does that stand right now?
Yeah. So the cluster hires of this type are something that I initiated at my two previous institutions. And when I first arrived at WSU, I started to talk to Kirk and other university leaders about whether there would be an opportunity to do this here at WSU. You know, in the previously, my experience has been that when you are going to hire a faculty member, oftentimes the diversity of the pool of candidates is determined by the time you write the job description. And there's often very little you can do once you've written the job description to change the diversity that's represented in the pool of candidates who come, whether that be the subfield of your discipline or, you know, advertising widely absolutely can help, reaching out to people can help, but oftentimes, if institutions really want to change and increase the diversity of their faculty, they need to start with the job description. My experience is that by focusing on racism and social inequality in the Americas, not only is that an opportunity to recruit and retain a more diverse faculty body, but also contribute to the scholarship in those areas, which we so desperately need at this point in WSU's history and in the nation's history. My experience also is that by doing that and showing a multi-year long-term commitment to those issues, that it leads to better retention of those faculty and their success, which is even more important. It also helps us transform the curriculum through the courses they teach and in our student bodies through their recruitment of both undergraduate and graduate students. So we hope this to be a multi-year hire. This year we're hiring in the Department of History, in Digital Technology and Culture program in Tri-Cities, in the School of Music, in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology, and in the School of Design and Construction. And next year we hope to focus our cluster hire on health justice in marginalized communities. So we hope this will be a multi-year hire, and as you can tell, I'm a little bit excited about it.
Well, I agree. It is exciting to see that progress being made. Thank you. President Schultz, you talked a little bit in your remarks about two different groups I'd love to have you spend a little bit more time on. One was President's Commission on Campus Culture and Climate, and then also you mentioned the President's Task Force on Equity in Policy and Practice. Can you talk about what the focus of those two groups are, and again, what kind of work we might be able to see coming out of those two organizations?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. The President's Commission is one that we're going to ask Jamie Nolan, who serves for Inclusive Excellence in Student Affairs with Lisa Guerrero, to work together on what that needs to look like, what the President's Commission's goals and objectives are. We already have faculty and staff and students that are doing a lot. What we don't want to do is just simply add people to another group without a clear idea of what we want, and I think we'll certainly put that out to the campus community to see. So that's still, a work in progress, but we're near the final stages there, and I look forward to getting those invitation letters out before the end of the semester, getting that group stood up. The second group was, as some of this work on diversity, equity, and inclusion was being talked about at the President's Cabinet and other leadership groups, you know, one of the things that's not a real sexy, exciting type of thing, but is to go back and look at some of our policies, procedures, and way we do things through an equity lens and ask ourselves, is it still meeting the needs of our community? Something that might have made sense 20 years ago or 25 years ago that we haven't updated it since that time. It's time to go back and look, and it's not just around diversity. It's also about, is this meeting the needs of our faculty, staff, and students of today? And we want to continue to look at this, spend lots of time on it, and this is not a quick type of thing that we look at a couple things over a short period of time. I suspect it's a multi-year effort, but it needs to be all part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion plan, which includes the cluster hires. It includes having leaders in the right position. It includes supporting our students of color that come from all these different places around the world into WSU. It needs to include all of these things, and we need then, as people come into our community, it's not just about recruitment. How do we make sure that when people are here, that we have policies that support a diverse community at all of our campuses? So that's what those two groups are going to do. I appreciate the faculty, staff, and students that serve on those and the leadership that they're bringing to the table. But it's not just about ideas. There ought to be an expectation that Elizabeth, myself, Mary Jo Gonzalez, and other leaders are stepping up and making things happen as these groups bring recommendations forward.
You know, one thing I'll say is as I think about the work of that task force on equity policy and practice, it makes me think about the writings of Ibram Kendi talking about how do you be an anti-racist? It's by really looking at those policies and addressing them. And so that gives me hope to see that our institution is looking at those underlying policies and asking the question, you know, does this inadvertently or overtly disadvantage certain groups or certain people? So I think that's important work. Somewhat along those lines, Elizabeth, I'd like to ask a question of you. The Board of Regents met, I don't know, about 10 days ago or so now, and one of the things they approved was the elimination of the SAT and AC tests as a requirement for the admissions process. Can you talk just briefly about how this action is an important step in addressing implicit cultural biases and the inequalities that racial and ethnic groups might experience with a standardized test?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Phil. You know, really, in a nutshell, there's a lot of research to show that there is cultural and particularly racial and ethnic bias in standardized testing and the SATs and the ACTs in particular. And we're actually joining about 1,300 other institutions that have either made the tests optional or blind, meaning that we're not even going to look at the scores. So what we decided to do, and the Board of Regents supported, is to not utilize those scores in decisions about admissions or financial aid, really permanently. We've made this a permanent change. That doesn't mean students might not take those tests for external scholarships, but we won't use those in admissions decisions. Instead, we'll look at GPA, grade point average, the kinds of classes they're taking, their extracurriculars, a much deeper dive into their background, which we find will support diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So before we move off of this topic, I guess I would ask the two of you, is there anything else that we haven't covered around the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we need to talk about today?
There is lots, but I don't know if we have time to continue. I don't know. What do you say, Kirk? Yeah.
Well, fair enough. Let's move on. You know, Elizabeth, you mentioned that you are entering your 9th month. I have to acknowledge the fact that you joined us at a very weird time. You came in the midst of the pandemic. You did not get a chance to meet your colleagues in person. When you made that comment today about meeting staff who were doing the drive-by event earlier today, you weren't joking. That really, I believe, was your first chance to meet a lot of these folks. So given the fact that you haven't had a chance to really interact with your colleagues, I'm curious about what your thoughts are now that you've been here for 9 months. What are your observations of the Pacific Northwest? I know you and your spouse are avid hikers. Have you found places that you've enjoyed hiking in particular? And do you have tips for the rest of us who might be looking for good hiking spots?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I do have to say that my husband and I said from the time we were married, which was 22 years ago, that if we ever left the Northeast, we wanted to live in the Pacific Northwest, because we had one of our first dates in Seattle and took a ferry among the San Juans and always felt like we wanted to come back here to live at some point. So I really felt like, even though it was an odd time to move across the country during a global pandemic to a place I had never been, with our 2 dogs and my son and husband and all of our belongings, you know, it's been an amazing experience so far. And I hope it's not just because it's a honeymoon period, but my colleagues are just amazing to a person. People are helpful, welcoming, and the beauty of both the Palouse and the Pacific Northwest has certainly not disappointed us at all.
Great, thank you. Before we move on to our last section, I'd love for us to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the lessons learned. I feel like the light is at the end of the tunnel. I think we're getting close to at least the new normal, if we're not there yet. And so what I'd like to do is we received a number of questions from people in advance that had to do with COVID. I'd like to just tackle a couple of these if we could before we close. One question is, and this is an interesting one, why has Washington State University not provided vaccines to faculty and staff members? Kirk, you want to address that one?
Absolutely, and I've had this question asked a lot, and I think in other states, for example, Oregon, California, and so on, faculty were at a lot of higher education institutions and K through 12 were given much earlier vaccines, and so people are like, well, how come WSU is not doing this? Well, part of it is we abide by the orders coming out of Olympia and Governor Inslee, and so we don't have any decision making about who gets what vaccines at what particular time. We do work closely with the governor's office. Colleen Kerr, our vice president for external affairs and government relations, works with the public health officials in each of the counties, works with the public health leadership in the governor's office, and certainly we make a case for why we think it's important for higher education to be, one of the first people in line, but we have zero control over that personally. So when people are like, how come the president and the provost or the deans aren't out there, getting us in line? We're really abiding by the regulations in the state of Washington, no different than University of Washington or any of the other higher education institutions in the state.
One of the big concerns that has come out of this past 12 plus months of lockdown is the question of mental health and the impact on the mental health of students, of faculty members, of staff members, of just members of the community. So I'm curious, what have each of you done to address your own mental health needs during this particularly difficult time?
Those of you who are friends with me on Facebook know that every weekend I go out, and I started this actually a year ago when we were first all shut down. My university was shut down in New York as well. And I started to go out and explore various hiking trails with my dogs that I had never been on. And so I try on every Saturday and every Sunday to explore a new trail or a new part of a trail. And I post beautiful photos on Facebook of those places, and I do #BeautyBreak. And some of my friends all around the country tell me how much they appreciate those and getting to see new places that they have never been or maybe never will get to visit. And so getting in the outdoors, hiking and exploring the beautiful state of Washington and neighboring Oregon and Idaho have been really my mental health breaks that I look forward to.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really been cutting way back on my sort of use of social media. And I think, for a while there, I found every time I had a break, picking up my phone, checking a media feed. And, we're in jobs, Elizabeth and I, where you get a lot of suggestions for maybe things that we could do differently. You get people objecting to decisions that we made. And if you're not careful, you can wind up almost being addicted to it. And so I just found a few months ago it was really important for me to just sort of cut back on that. And for me personally, it's been a great decision. And I think that's sort of helped me to remain focused and not necessarily continue to scroll through Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and things like that all the time, because if you're not careful, you can spend a lot of your waking time on that. And that's helped my mental health quite a bit as we've gone through COVID-19.
Great. So here's a question again for the two of you. As we are entering our 13th month of distance existence, what are some of the lessons that we've learned during this? As we prepare for returning to the classroom, returning to our offices, what are some of the things that we might continue to do that we've learned about during this 12-month or 13-month period?
Yeah.
Well, I think, we use Zoom as truly a four-letter word in some households, but I think Zoom has also changed some of the way that we operate as a system. For example, we already do cabinet meetings that are with people spread across the state of Washington, and we do it via Zoom. And everybody's the same size. We don't have people sitting in different conference rooms trying to interact. And it's really changed the way that we interact. I think Elizabeth and I, for example, also found out as we put forward those concept papers that some of the challenges pre-COVID-19 with faculty outside of Pullman feeling disconnected sometimes from their Pullman colleagues, we found a lot of people reinforcing, hey, because of COVID-19 and Zoom, I feel part of my department. It doesn't matter where I am. I feel a much better part and of the intellectual part of being associated with the department. So one of the things I think that we've learned that's really important for us is moving ahead when we go back to whatever normal looks like is to ensure that we don't go back to meetings where we have a few people sitting around a table with a little camera up there and a few other people trying to call in. That what we do is we keep some of this way of interacting across the system as a really positive indicator of ways that we can work together. And I'm just not sure we would have gotten there, frankly, without COVID-19 and without the pandemic. So to me, it's one of those silver linings where I think we've really learned something that we want to keep as part of our WSU culture moving forward.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that the same applies to instructional delivery. And I've had a number of faculty tell me that there are some things that they've learned that they can make remote. And then there are other things that they've realized the value of in-person interaction and those really high impact learning experiences. We're already talking about how we can implement some of those lessons we've learned starting as early as this fall semester.
As we bring this conversation to a close, I would be interested in hearing from each of you how you might sum up the current state of the university. What excites you about the opportunities ahead, and what motivates you as we think about the future of WSU?
Well, I would say I remain tremendously excited about our potential. And I think we've learned some things about how to work together effectively through COVID-19. I think the work that everybody did on putting us on a firm financial footing prior to COVID-19 also means that we're going to be able to emerge from COVID-19 in a much better place than some of our colleagues around the nation. I think we've had great ideas that have come forward, and when Elizabeth talked about the cluster hiring, one of the things that she found was we got something like 27 proposals from campus that said, hey, we want to participate. So I think we're finding that people are continuing to be creative and looking ahead. I also want to acknowledge, though, and not be seen as sort of the clueless leader. Microsoft released a study, and it was in the news media today, and USA Today and the Seattle Times, that talked about a lot of supervisors are like, hey, everything's going great. And then you talk to rank and file employees anywhere, and they're miserable, not happy with their work experience, feeling stressed out. So I think one of the things that I want to make sure that we do is as we come out of COVID-19 is that we don't treat it like nothing ever happened. I think we have to allow people to move back to a rhythm of their workplace and their workspace that feels good to them. And that's going to be different for everybody. And so I want to make sure that we recognize the challenges that many people are feeling, the many challenges that will lie ahead. But I think if I look at how we've come through this, I think our future is incredibly bright, and I'm privileged to be able to serve as president of Washington State University. Look forward to continuing to do great things. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would just really like to underscore that last point that Kirk made, which is that, it's been said often, but is so true, that the pandemic has really underscored and highlighted, certainly racial and social inequalities that we need to address as a nation, and WSU has really embraced change in that direction, which has been really encouraging and exciting to me. But also we've learned, Kirk mentioned getting off of social media, or I mentioned making sure to get outside after you've been staring at a Zoom screen for hours and hours on end. I feel I've heard from colleagues here that we have learned, and I hope will continue to learn, to be kind to ourselves and to one another, to give each other a break, to remember that people have caregiving responsibilities. They sometimes have other jobs. Our students have, financial burdens and family burdens and come from all walks of life. And so I think it's really highlighted those, and I think it will make us stronger coming out the other side of this. And I want to echo what Kirk said. It's been a privilege the past 8.5 months, and I'm really excited about the future here.
So President Schultz, I'll give you the last word.
Well, to Cougs everywhere, thank you for watching today. Thank you for all that you do for our students, for the state of Washington. And on behalf of Elizabeth and myself, we look forward to continuing to work together as a community to make ourselves better, to keep the things that we do so well as part of there, but to continue to look to evolve, to change, and to make sure that we're just meeting the needs of the state of Washington for our students as part of our land grant mission. So thanks for being with us. Look forward to doing this again next year, and as always, go Cougs.